Well, the last time we spoke, we talked about the new national security strategy, and you made the point that there wasn't much strategy in that either. But the reference to the Americas, though, was more or less, yeah, the Western Hemisphere have to be come back under U.S. control, given that there's now other centers of power. So can't afford to have the Chinese, for example, or the Russians operating in Latin America. And this has been something we've seen in the rhetoric about Venezuela as well. That is. Yes, we have not just Hamas and Hezbollah in Iran, but also have Russians and Chinese in Venezuela, which is not acceptable as this is America's backyard. But given that he actually put the term Monroe Doctrine into the national security strategy, do you see this being part of a wider development to put all of America's or denying access to other great powers? I know the original Monroe Doctrine was to deny European empires the ability to set up, but this is, again, something different. It would be to deny what economic activity or with other great powers. So how is this how are you assessing this?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. The European audience needs to understand that this Monroe Doctrine was mentioned briefly by President Monroe and then vanished for all intents and purposes from the discussion politically in Washington or anywhere else until the 1920s. It was resurrected in the 1920s because we had participated in the First World War, and virtually everyone concluded by the 1920s that had been a terrible mistake, that all we did was rescue British and French imperialism. We lost 110,000 dead in 110 days fighting on the Western Front. People were horrified. And so President Harding and his successors in the 20s all said, we don't want to do this again. This is the last thing we ever want. And so the Monroe Doctrine came back into vogue or into usage then. And then we developed a strategy called hemispheric defense. And that essentially said, we're going to defend the hemisphere from everybody outside of it, so don't challenge us here. Now, having said all of that, I don't think it's very meaningful now at all. I think that's another sort of shibboleth resurrected to persuade people of something that's not really a problem. Glenn, we in North America, we, the United States, have dominated the Western Hemisphere almost from the moment that we won the War of 1812. I mean, once the British pulled out after they had another war without any strategy. It didn't work out very well for them. And so they said the devil with this and largely pulled out. I think what we're dealing with right now is something similar. It's there. When we talk about, again, it's back to strategy. There is no strategy. Now, do we want the Chinese out? Well, that's become very popular. You know, anywhere you see Chinese evidence for Chinese business or commercial interest, that's a threat. That has to be stopped. That has to be crushed. Nobody has passed any legislation inside the United States preventing the Chinese from investing and owning great quantities of agricultural land in the U.S. And I always tell people, well, if you're very concerned about the Chinese, let's start at home here, as opposed to telling everyone else who lives in the Western Hemisphere you can't do business with the Chinese. And here's a message for everybody. The Chinese are heavily engaged all over South America. And the Chinese are basically businessmen. They are there to get something. They want something, whether it's soybeans, which they recently managed to get from places like Argentina and Brazil, or they're looking for mineral wealth, or oil or anything else. If they can't get it from Venezuela, they're not going to go to war. They're going to go somewhere else. The world is a big place. The Chinese are not interested in fighting for anything. They want to do business. The Russians are a little different. They're not as heavily invested commercially. For the Russians, they were very interested in the gold, frankly, that is in Venezuela. Venezuela supposedly has 22 billion in hard gold reserves, and they have a lot of gold in the country. The Russians are not going to lose any sleep over it, though, because Russia, according to most of the sources, if you go research them, apparently has more gold sitting in Russia than any other country in the world. So it's not life or death for Russia, just as it's not life or death for Russia or China or anybody else about the oil in Venezuela. So it's very hard to sort through all of the rhetoric and the discussions and the statements. By the way, during this so-called period of the Monroe Doctrine, there were over 30,000 troops from France in Mexico, or it's 30,000 French troops. So who are we kidding? This whole Monroe Doctrine thing is unworthy of serious attention. But people are not stupid, and the Chinese and the Russians, the Iranians, anybody else who has an interest in Venezuela is not stupid. They are not going to challenge us in the Southern Caribbean, in the Caribbean Basin. We should never have challenged the Russians in Ukraine. It was a dumb idea strategically. How dumb can you get? The Russians can win any battle on their turf. We can win any battle in the Southern Caribbean. It is simply a fact of life. So I think there are a lot of people that they're treated to these sort of tropes about democracy, freedom, rights, or not, democracy, human rights, and freedom. We said the same things about Iraq. We've said that in many, many places at many different times. It's all meaningless. But I think this time around, Washington has sort of fooled itself in a big way. We're not going to profit very much in the short run at all from anything we do in Venezuela. And I think we're going to see conditions there develop very negatively for us. And I hope the president will at least have the good sense to keep us out. Committing the 14, 15, 16,000 troops sitting in Puerto Rico at this point would be asking for real trouble. But that may yet happen.
Yeah, I thought Trump was a bit premature to. I mean, it was a little bit like his Bush mission accomplished moment, where he, he said we're going to run Venezuela until we find a new government, but they don't actually control Venezuela yet. They captured um, Maduro and put him on a perp walk, but beyond that, this is not quite a victory yet, which he might have taken a bit premature. But I've seen a lot from the Israeli media, though, that they kind of link how quickly the United States took down the Venezuelan president, and essentially, well, more or less saying Venezuela today, Iran tomorrow. Do you see this as a logical step? Because before you listed some Latin American countries, which Trump would go after next.
Yeah, but I don't think he will, for the very reasons that we're discussing. You can go in and initially remove whatever key people you would like, but that doesn't fundamentally change the situation on the ground in any of those countries. If you're going to try and change it, well, then you have to go in on the ground. We were in Vietnam, and at the height of the Vietnam conflict, we were there for 10 years, at least 8 years with troops. And at the height of the war, we had 550,000 men on the ground in South Vietnam. We never completely controlled Vietnam. If you go to North Africa and Algeria, and you look at the French there, they always controlled whatever they could stand on for any length of time. And when they took their foot off it, they no longer controlled it. I mean, this is the sort of thing that you learn from history, and we don't seem to have learned it very much. I always liked Genghis Khan's observation about occupations. He said occupations turn soldiers into jailers. So the Mongols never occupied anything. The Mongols would leave a small force inside the country near the capital, the ruling elite, and they knew that they had to pay the tribute and do what the Mongols said as far as the Mongol interest was, and the Mongol interest was largely commercial and taxes. As long as they did that, they were safe. If they violated that, then the Mongols would return and kill everybody. But he did not bring in hundreds of thousands of Mongolian troops to occupy anything because it was a waste of time. It's amazing how frequently we make this mistake. We just can't do it. And the other thing is we go back to World War II. Well, look what we did in Germany. Look what we did in Japan. Well, at the time, the Germans were very cooperative because there were 15 million Soviet troops sitting on the other side, 5 million poised to attack West. So under those circumstances, I think you could expect cooperation out of the Germans. I mean, we got to make a choice. Communism and Russians versus Americans and Brits. In Japan, it was a little different. We had flattened the country. We'd killed hundreds of thousands of people in the bombings, and Japan was prostrate, and the decision was made, we'll cooperate. And obviously, they also knew they had the threat of Soviet intervention. They didn't want the Soviets landing in Japan and raping all the women and destroying Japanese culture and civilization, which is what they did wherever they went in Eastern Europe. So there were reasons why the Japanese and the Germans cooperated. And the other thing is that we were a little more enlightened in those days. We recognized that the people that had to rebuild the country were local, indigenous. In other words, the Japanese and Germans. And the Japanese and Germans, very sophisticated, highly educated people, very intelligent. And ultimately, they took over and they rebuilt the country. We've gone to various places. We deal with people who are radically different from the Japanese and the Germans, and we're surprised things don't work. Now we're in Latin America. We're not going to have any success in Venezuela. Nobody down there wants us in their country. I'm quite certain of that. And, I listened to Secretary of State Rubio on Sunday talk about, well, we want two things. We want success for America. We want the Venezuelan people to be successful. We want them to be happy. Okay, good luck with that. Nobody wants a foreign army in their country under any circumstances. So we're back to where we started, Glenn. What's the plan? And the plan doesn't exist. And frankly, I don't know what they're going to come up with.